Hello? Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Hi.
Obama.
Hi. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
All right. Um, hey, are the birds still in the background?
No, they're not. Thank God.
You have the exact time and
I like
place.
the birds. I thought they were nice.
Well, it's not your stream, so I don't give a fuck. All right. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I am a detransitioner. I consider myself female to male to female. I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria when I was 14. My parents were not very accepting of trans people, though. So I didn't transition until I was 20. I was on hormones for about 3 years,
Were
and I
you
got
on
a
like HRT for? I don't know if they call it HRT for men, or do they just call it TRT if you're going from female to male? What do they call it? Or
HRT can be for either trans men or trans women.
okay, were you on
Or
HRT or
sometimes
just puberty blockers? Sorry, go ahead.
I was on HRT, so I went through a female puberty
Okay,
because even though I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria as a teenager, like my parents wouldn't let me do anything related to that.
gotcha.
So, yeah, I was on testosterone for about 3-ish years, and I got a double mastectomy.
Okay,
Um, and then about a year ago, I would say, I started to realize that my transition wasn't really going as planned. I wasn't passing very well, and that was a very like distressing experience for me because I kind of wanted to blend in.
mm-hmm.
It was very stressful to be read as trans all the time and for people not really to know how to refer to me or how to treat me.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually I tried living as a woman again to see if it was doable, and it was. I think my dysphoria was largely mitigated by the processes that I did get, so the hormones and the surgery. Um, so now I just kind of live as like a butch woman.
Okay, can I? Okay, sorry. Usually I do these disclaimers in text, but if I ask a question and you're not comfortable answering something, you have no obligation to answer anything. And then if there's like, if you feel like the conversation is going in a direction you don't like, you can always tell me to fuck off or whatever. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I'm curious. So some of these questions might be a bit too personal, or you don't have to. Yeah, you don't have to say if you don't want. I'm really curious. So starting with you being 14, can you explain like man, there's so many different things. Okay. You said that you were 14 and you were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, but you're in an area where it seems like your parents don't really support anything related to trans stuff.
That's right.
Can you explain what was the process of like, did you just go to a random therapist and they diagnosed you to that? Was it like a gender affirming care area, or how did you come across like that diagnosis? Like, how did you get to an area where you had that diagnosis?
Um, at the time, I grew up very religious. My
Mm-hmm.
parents were very religious. We were Jehovah's Witnesses, and they very much don't like mental health interventions. But it had gotten to the point where I was extremely depressed and like suicidal almost.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what finally let them um, take me to, I believe it was like a childhood therapist or counselor of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to them about the feelings that I was having, and they were the ones who diagnosed me with gender dysphoria along with like clinical depression and anxiety.
What were the feelings that you had? Like, did you feel something akin to dysphoria? Did you just feel depressed and like dissociated, or what was like the I guess like the feelings that you felt like you had?
Kind of hard to explain. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I always felt kind of like I didn't relate to a lot of the girls my age.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I was often very boyish, like when I was a young child, and my friends were boys.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I started hitting puberty, it became less and less socially acceptable for me to like be around boys and kind of relate to them on like a fraternal sort of way.
Yeah.
And that's when my dysphoria like really got worse, or when I began to kind of realize that this was
Mm-hmm.
something related to gender that was not just like a depression associated with like normal puberty or like teenagehood.
Gotcha.
That makes sense?
Yeah, actually. So I'm making these words up now because I haven't read this anywhere. It just it kind of seems to be a thing. It feels like broadly there's like kind of like two types of dysphorias that I've seen explained to me. It feels like there's like a social gender dysphoria where there's a certain set of actions that you perform that don't align with your gender, and then people kind of give you a lot of social pushback for it. And then it feels like there's like this internal sexual dysphoria where you have like this kind of like disgust or this dissociated feeling from your body because of how it looks. Do you feel like your dysphoria was mainly the social one? Do you feel like it was a combination of the two? Do you feel like one led to the other, or do you reject this dichotomy at all? Or yeah, I'm curious about that. Did you ever have a feeling of like an intense dislike of your body, or was it mainly tied to a lot of the social roles that you were expected to take on or behaviors that you had to have?
I feel like it was mostly towards the social stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I did realize when I got older, I feel like some of the sexual dysphoria, dysmorphia, kind of got worse as time went on.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like the worse that my social dysphoria got, the worse that my sex dysphoria got.
Gotcha.
So it was like being treated as a woman, being seen in this way that I didn't want to be seen,
Mm-hmm.
kind of made me feel worse about myself and feeling like I needed to change myself so that people saw me the way that I wanted to be seen.
Sure. Something that I've had described to me a lot now that I didn't even realize was a thing. I'm curious if this happened with you. A lot of trans people that have emailed me have described that like, I think it's literally like the day or second day that they start HRT, there's like this like wash of relief over their body that something feels like fundamentally or markedly different. Do you recall feeling that way when you started HRT, or did you have a different feeling, or?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I did feel that.
Uh-huh.
I felt that, yeah, it was pretty much like I don't know if it was like psychological more than physical.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was also like looking for effects to start on like day 1 or 2
Sure,
or 3.
yeah.
It doesn't really, it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it for sure did make me feel a lot better about myself getting on HRT.
Mm-hmm.
But I did feel like over time, that feeling began to wane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that was just because I did have very like unrealistic expectations for what HRT would do for me.
Gotcha. Okay, so these get like, I'm trying to think of how to phrase these. These get like kind of personal, so again, if you're not comfortable answering, you don't have to. It feels like socially, female to male is a bit easier in terms of passing because you can have kind of like effeminate or androgynous looking men, and they seem to be accepted more than like androgynous looking women because they tend to just be seen as masculine. Did you have a hard time, like even if you dressed kind of manly, were people still like misgendering you, or you just didn't feel like you fit in, or what was the feeling of like, why do you feel like you how could you tell, I guess, that you weren't passing the way that you wanted to be?
So yeah, I did try to appear as masculine as possible. Like I only wore men's clothes. I styled my hair in like a masculine sort of way. But I was pretty, not consistently, but fairly often getting still called a woman. And I think it was mostly because of things that were a lot harder to control. So like the way my body is shaped, like I have pretty wide hips, so people
Okay.
would notice that.
Sure.
And like the way that I walked, or like having a bit of a round face, those are things that people would notice. And eventually I would try additional things like trying to do voice training, or like stifling your mannerisms to seem a little bit more masculine, trying to walk in a different way, but it didn't always work. And eventually I started considering getting like facial masculinization surgery and procedures like this. But I felt like I didn't want them on like a personal level. It felt like I wanted them just so that I could blend in better. And I was very worried, like what if I got this and it did help me pass, but I don't like the way that I look anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Or like, you know, what if I get them and I don't pass? What then?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I had to I had to reframe like what I wanted to do in terms of like my transition. If I wanted to keep trying to go towards this goal that I had, that might never be quite attainable.
Sure. Did you try to like fully socially transition before getting on hormones, or did you do everything kind of at the same time?
Um, so I began hormones about 3 months after coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little bit of a wait, but I certainly didn't get all of my like social bearings together by the
Gotcha.
time I started hormones.
Um, so on timelines, you were on hormones for, was it 3 years?
Yeah, thereabout.
Why, I guess, actually, wait, before getting, because I'm curious, like, what made you decide to slowly change your mind? How did you decide to start? So I imagine your parents probably weren't too supportive. Had you heard about, like, any trans stuff, like, publicly? Like, did you, like, were there YouTubers you watched or, like, friends at school that knew anything? Or were you, like, in a really conservative area? Or how did you, like, get to the point where you made the decision to, like, I want to start transitioning?
Um, so like I heard about being trans when I was probably fairly young,
Mm-hmm.
and like a lot of people describe it as like something clicking, and it very much felt that way for me.
Mm-hmm.
Where once I heard about this concept, it felt like I related to that very much.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never like super active in any, like there wasn't any trans or really LGBT groups where I was growing up because it was like a very rural conservative community.
Mm-hmm.
But even when I got older, I wasn't really involved in trans communities very much. Um, yeah, I
When you
so it
say
wasn't like
when you say I'm out of it clicking, are you saying that like as soon as when you were 14 and you got the diagnosis, you were like, oh, this makes a lot of sense? Or
yeah.
gotcha. So then I guess how did you if you got drugs as a teenager, I imagine your parents approved it. What was the process like with them approving it? Like, why were they on board with it
Well,
if they were initially? Or go ahead.
well, no, I didn't transition as a teenager. I just got the diagnosis of gender dysphoria
Oh,
when I was
okay,
a
gotcha.
teenager.
So you were
I didn't transition until I was 20.
20. Okay, gotcha. Okay, so it was after you were an adult.
Yeah.
What did your parents have any input or try to help you or do anything, I guess, to avoid you having to go the drug route when you had that diagnosis, or
No, not really.
they just told you that you'll grow out of it? Basically, they didn't offer any support.
Yeah, I started antidepressants pretty soon after that,
Mm-hmm.
and that did help to a certain degree. But as far as like gender dysphoria itself and like feeling this incongruence with my gender, they
Mm-hmm.
just kind of pretended like it wasn't there.
Gotcha. So, okay, so 14, you got the diagnosis. When you were 20, you started to actually transition. You were on that for 3 years, you said?
Yes.
And then you changed. Oh, yeah, okay, so talk to me about, like, how you finally got this idea that, well, maybe this isn't the right path for me, or, like, what moved you in that direction, I guess.
So I guess it was just thinking like after 3 years on
Didn't say
testosterone,
Simon
it felt
Says.
like I had gotten most of the changes that I could expect
Mm-hmm.
from it. So it was just kind of coming to terms with the fact that like this isn't going to be like a matter of just waiting for the effects to kick in for me to start passing.
Mm-hmm.
And I already felt like I was trying really, really hard to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if this was going to be something that I would have to do forever. And that thought was just very distressing for me because it was getting to the point where I couldn't be very present in like social situations
Mm-hmm.
because I was so obsessed with like how does my voice sound right now, or like am I being too feminine with my mannerisms,
Yeah.
or waiting for somebody to use a pronoun to see how they viewed me. And that was just very tiring. And realizing that made me feel like I needed to just reassess how things were going.
So this is like this is kind of a probing question, but like it sounds like, hold on, let me phrase this better. It seems like, or do you ever wonder that it could be the case that actually this, you are trans and that was the right path, but maybe you just like weren't getting the results that you wanted, so now you're kind of like, I don't want to say like taking the path of least resistance, but like, yeah, how do you know, or I guess, so you described yourself as being like you've, I think you use the term butch lesbian, right? Or butch woman, basically?
Butch woman.
Butch woman, yeah, not lesbian, butch woman. So you use the term butch woman. Like, is the internal view of yourself now as like a masculine woman, or like like you're still trans but you just didn't get the results that you wanted, or like how does all that work? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, I don't expect you to
yeah.
have like a 100% like here's the answer to this question. Of course, I'm sure there's still like a lot of this that you're even still thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I see it is like, I do feel like if things had gone the way I wanted it to during my transition, then I probably still would be living like as a trans man today. But I don't necessarily think that that means I'm just like a trans man in denial, or that like that's the only way I could live. Because I just feel like when I made the decision to transition, I did it because I wanted to better myself and live in a way that felt best for me. And it felt like the longer I was going on without reaching my transition goals, the further away I was getting from that original goal. Like, it no longer felt like it was for me. It no longer felt like it was bettering me as a person.
Do you think, okay, so these are tougher questions. I understand this. Okay. Sorry, I'm repeating this a lot, so it doesn't feel like I'm trying to like box you or anything. Because it almost sounds like you, hold on, let me think for a second for how I want to phrase this.
Okay.
Well, so, because one question that I would be curious to ask, what I would ask is, do you feel like there's, in a perfect world, do you feel like there is something you wish you would have heard to keep you from ever transitioning initially? But that doesn't seem like the appropriate question. The appropriate question now seems like, in a perfect world, do you wish that there would have been a way for you to perfectly transition? Because then if you would have, I imagine you would be living as a trans male today, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I feel like if there was a perfect world where I could just, look exactly how I want to look and be read as a male all the time, that would have saved me from a lot of grief and struggle. But at the same time, I do feel like, I don't regret transitioning. I'm glad that I did it. And I feel like I know myself a lot better now that I did. Something that's interesting is that, like, when you ID as trans, there's a lot of pressure to be like 100% sure of it.
Yeah.
And for a while, when I was IDing as a trans man, I framed my experiences in a sort of way that reaffirmed that identity. So there were certain times where I felt like I related more to women, but I felt like I wasn't able to really express that because I was a man, or I wanted to be seen as a man.
Sure. So
and
some struggles
like,
you'd end up reframing basically as like trying to make it fit into this like male paradigm kind of, or?
Right, yeah. And then, when I went through the process of detransitioning, I was able to kind of think about those experiences again and recognize that, maybe this was the way things were supposed to be. I don't know if that makes sense.
As
Like
in you were
maybe I
supposed
wasn't
to, like, or what? Yeah, what do you mean when you say that?
like maybe being a binary trans man wasn't exactly how I felt about myself,
Mm-hmm.
but it was like the best option that I had at the time,
Sure.
or it was the only way that I knew how to express some of the feelings that I had.
Do you one of the things that I have the most difficulty with as somebody that I say, or I feel like I'm not that attached to my gender, but I mean, it's hard for me to know that, right? Because I've only lived as my gender, right? So maybe I would feel a lot differently. One of the questions that I kind of always have internally for trans people is, how do you know that you're not just like a very like a masculine woman, or you're just like a woman that has like a lot of behaviors that are kind of like masculine versus like feeling like a man? I guess now having like transition and detransition and kind of like living on both ends of the kind of the sex spectrum, and then like changing your presentation and everything. Do you have any like feelings about that question, or like is there a big difference to you emotionally? Or yeah, I'm curious to hear you like speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky to figure out for
Yeah.
sure. Like there I've talked to people who've had like similar experiences to me, where they go like in a very binary direction and then they go back or they're not really sure if that was the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to get like caught in these thought loops of like, am I a man? Am I a woman? Am I something in between?
Mm-hmm.
And you can go down those loops forever.
Yeah,
Like
of course. Yeah.
it's very difficult. The way that I try to think about it isn't so much like teasing out this one static identity that's inside of yourself that you need to figure out,
Mm-hmm.
but more like actionable things, I suppose. Like, how do I want to be seen in terms of my gender or my sex? Is there like are there characteristics that I would rather change about myself?
Mm-hmm.
And using those as starting points rather than just like abstract feelings.
Sure. Have you ever wrestled with the concept of like non-binary? Like, do you ever think that that might be a better explainer for your, I guess, your gender or your feelings? Or
Yeah, so I've had people tell me that they think I might be non-binary,
mm-hmm.
and I very much understand that
Mm-hmm.
because there are obviously I transitioned, so there's some sort of like gender non-conforming thing there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I certainly have like experiences that are both kind of like male typical and experiences that are female typical, so somewhere in between
Mm-hmm.
might make sense. I guess for me personally, there's just I have a hard time figuring out the difference between like actually being neither a man or a woman and just being kind of like a woman in a different sort of way. Like
Gotcha.
how do I how do I distinguish between being like non-binary and just being like a gender non-conforming woman?
Yeah, this is always like, and understandably, this is like an incredibly difficult question. I don't know if anybody has a good answer to this, but it's always something that's so curious. Like, how do you see yourself as being like a feminine person versus a woman, or like a masculine? Like, what's the difference between masculinity and male, or femininity and female? Like, what does that exist like inside? I kind of already asked this. You said it was a really difficult question, and I understand it's really difficult, but yeah, I don't know. Now you present at, do you have any, so you don't regret like the whole transition process? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you feel like, why? Because you feel like it let you explore yourself more, or because it was the best thing to do at the time, or what does that feel like? Yeah.
A bit of both of those. Like, I was definitely operating on like the best options and information that I had for myself at the time. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to like blame myself for, eventually coming back to where I started.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And I do think that I learned a lot about myself and kind of what my goals are, how I want to be seen by people.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I do think that I still benefit from what I got out of transition. So, like, even now, even though I know like I might look a little strange because I had a double mastectomy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I still am glad that I got it because I think if I hadn't, I would still have like a lot of dysphoria around my chest. Um, I feel like maybe to a certain extent, the only reason why I was only able to detransition and be okay with that was because I was able to mitigate my dysphoria through transitioning.
Interesting. Um, hold on. Let me just think about that for a second.
Okay.
So something that I would ask is, it feels like a lot of women view their breasts as being a really important part of their femininity. That's like really big. Because I've dated smaller chested women and then talked to smaller chested women, and one of the big complaints for women with smaller boobs is that it makes them feel sometimes like less of a woman because they don't have that, like, the shape of their body, that like prototypical thing. And it's not even like I want big boobs so I can show off huge cleavage to everybody. It's just that like boobs feel like a pretty like defining thing sometimes, at least what we're told socially of, or at least in the West, for femininity. So you feel, I guess you feel now like a lot of your dysphoria was alleviated because of what is like gender affirming surgery, right? Because of top surgery. But now you feel like you're back in like the woman area, but the only reason you're okay being a woman now is because you're, I don't want to say slightly less of a woman, that sounds horrible, but right, because you've gotten rid of some feminine features. I guess like a lot of what you described to me, it sounds like, well, I don't even know really what non-binary is, but it sounds more and more like that, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. Talk. I'm just like blurting out random stuff. I'm just curious. I don't have any solid answers here. I don't expect you to have any either. Yeah, but
Yeah, that's something I've thought about as well. Is like I I can say that I'm a woman, and in some senses that feels right, but you know, I do have to grapple with the fact that most women do like having breasts and do feel like that's part of their identity as a woman, and would be very distressed if, you know, they had to get a mastectomy for like cancer or something like that. So you know, maybe I am non-binary, but I don't know. When it comes to like identity labels, they feel more theoretical than practical. I feel like I could say, you know, I'm a woman or I'm non-binary, but I don't think that's going to change like how I present myself or how people are going to treat me or refer to me, unless I, you know, ask them to do so.
so today, so before, if you would have been identified as a woman while you were trying to present as a male, that would have bothered you. If today, if people immediately see you and they identify you as a woman, does that not cause you trouble anymore because you're seen as like a different type of woman? Or do you think you've, well, I guess actually, so with that question, to frame the context of that question, one thing that people will often say, usually it's right wingers, right? I'm not trying to like give any of that thing, but like sometimes people say like, oh, like sometimes being trans can be like a confusing part of adolescence that you kind of like grow out of. Do you feel like you've kind of grown out of that, or do you feel like you've changed a bit, like through your personal exploration that doesn't bother you, or like how do you feel in terms of that, like people identify you as a woman, but now it causes you less issues than it used to? How has that changed internally?
So this might sound a little strange, but I I kind of feel like I talked myself out of being socially dysphoric to a certain extent. Um, so when I was first going through all of this, I tried thinking about like, well, why does it make me so upset when people view me as a woman? And the answer that I had for myself was that, well, society has all these expectations for women and these ideas for what a woman should be, and I don't want those things to be placed on me. I don't want people to think that that's what I need to be. Um, and that's what was so distressing to me. But I felt like, you know, whether I was trans or cis, I feel like it's probably wrong to assume that because someone's a woman that they have to act a certain way or be a certain way. So I feel like that would be a bad thing regardless of whether I was dysphoric about it or not. So I try to think now that like if somebody is reading me as a woman or telling me that I'm a woman, referring to me a certain way, that it doesn't necessarily have to mean that they're ascribing all of these, stereotypically feminine things to me, or saying that's how I need to be.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like, did you have, when you were going through the process of transitioning outside of your teens and everything, when you turned 20, I imagine you got to speak to other trans people, yeah? You got to,
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like your experience was atypical? Do you feel like your experience was typical? Or do you feel like there is no typical experience? All of them are fairly unique? I'm mainly hitting on, with this question, earlier I said it seems like there's this like social dysphoria and there's like this physical, biological dysphoria, and it feels like yours was heavily on the social side. Do you feel like that was pretty normal for for most trans people? Or do you feel like some of them hit it like really big on the biological side and not the social side? Yeah, I'm curious, what are your feelings about that, or your thoughts on that for the people that you spoke with?
I feel like people, as far as like me relating to them, I did feel like a lot of my dysphoria was maybe more socially oriented than others. And before we started our call, you were talking a little bit about how there are kind of like two camps of trans people.
Yeah.
And I feel like people who kind of have this more assimilationist view, I guess, of transness often tend to have like a quite biologically oriented dysphoria, or at least that's what I've noticed in my experience. As far as if I felt like my experience was typical, I did feel like, so a lot of trans men will describe themselves as like they are men and they are transgender, and
Wait, did you say they're men or bear men?
they're men.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, just okay. A lot of trans men will describe themselves as that they're men. Okay, gotcha.
They're men who are transgender. But for me, I felt more uncomfortable like saying that I was just another type of man. I felt like I was a trans man, not just a man who was transgender. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a little bit. Like how internalized was your new identity? And it felt like you hadn't fully internalized the concept of being male. You still felt like a woman that was just like on drugs or something, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
like a little bit of a different gender from being a man. So like seeing trans man and man as like two separate categories.
Which I think, to be fair, I think that's pretty common of a lot of people. It's like
yeah.
I hate to say this because I don't want to give people more power to be transphobic, but like I think secretly, or from things that I've read, like the biggest fear of like a trans person is that like everybody around them is like treating them one way, but they still secretly see them as like you're a man that's pretending or whatever, and that's like a huge like imposter syndrome fear that a lot of people have relating to, I guess, like trans stuff.
For sure. And I think it's difficult to say, like, was that like a sign that I was not just a binary trans man, or was that like just internalized fear that I wasn't going to be read the way that I wanted to be read? Or yeah, it's just hard to kind of figure out what that was exactly. I'm sorry, my cats are being insane right now.
You're fine. I can't hear them, so you're good.
Okay.
Okay. Well, anything else you wanna go over or chat about, or?
I don't know. Like, I guess have you had like any talks with detransitioners before, or do you have any background on this topic, or?
Yeah, I mean, you probably know this better than I do. It's an incredibly contentious area.
Yeah.
Yeah, because conservatives want to use you as examples of basically child abuse. It feels like some trans communities don't want to acknowledge your existence at all.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit strange. Yeah, I think detransitioners represent like a scary thing, because theoretically there are parts of your story that can be utilized to say like, well, look, this person talked themselves out of being trans. Everybody can, right? It's all fake.
Yeah.
yeah, it's just it's a really hard topic to get into. Like as soon as you get into anything relating to detransition, you're in like a war battlefield. Do you ever feel that pull in real life? Do you ever, I don't know like how embedded you are in like local social issues. I don't know where you live or whatever. Do you ever feel like this is something that you kind of deal with, or?
Not really in real life,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly online.
Yeah.
um,
Do you live
yeah,
in you don't have to tell me the city. I don't know if you're comfortable. Do you live like in is it a pretty conservative area or?
I live in Chicago, in the city, so
Okay.
quite progressive.
Gotcha. Okay.
Um, but yeah, the polarization is really crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first started thinking about detransitioning, I looked for, spaces online, or like research sources of some sort, and it was
Yeah.
just it was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
it, it's like you said, like on one side it felt like, often trans groups felt like they needed to say that detransitioning was always because of transphobia,
Mm-hmm.
and if it's for any other reason, then those people are just cisgender, and we don't really need to pay attention to them in the trans community.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be very alienating because, I did live several years with a trans experience, and to some extent still have a little bit of a trans experience because of the way my body is.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, um, yeah, like you said, the idea that, well, if I could stop being trans and other people can just stop being trans, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that can be a really dangerous road to go down, and it can make it very hard to talk about these experiences, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Something that's really difficult. There was a Twitter thread on this. I think I saw a week ago, and man, it was a battlefield. But basically, a guy made a big thread, and he was saying that as we become more and more open about trans issues, we all need to be open to the fact that there's going to be more detransitioners too. Just as more people have access to gender affirming care, like just on a numbers game naturally, like we probably expect to see more people detransition, and that's okay. It's okay that that's a thing, right? Which I largely agree with, but. Yeah, obviously that thread was highly contentious with a lot of people in that particular thread in the trans community were saying like, no, this isn't true. Like detransitioning is mainly not a thing. And other people were saying that like, yeah, of course, more people are going to detransition because it's child abuse and it's horrible. But yeah, it feels like, I guess one of the biggest things, and obviously I've discovered this firsthand, one of the saddest things for trans people, not even for cis people like me that just debate on the topic, like debate lords, is it feels like the worst thing is trans people don't have like a safe space to like explore and kind of question, which it feels like is kind of the most important thing. Because I mean, like you said, and like I think everybody would say, topics related to gender are really hard. Like, what's the difference between being like what's the difference between being like a really masculine like tomboy versus like being a trans person versus being a cross-dresser versus being somebody who just likes drag versus like, it's really hard to narrow all this out, and it's really hard. It's even harder to find like a place to have those conversations where somebody isn't trying to hijack your narrative for whatever political pet project or cause they feel strongly about, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree for sure. It can be very difficult, and it's very difficult as well for people who are considering detransitioning because there aren't really spaces to question or to explore those feelings without, people taking those ideas and running with them and saying, you're going to end up regretting this, you're going to end up questioning this if you go through with transitioning.
Mm-hmm. When you were thinking about, I guess, like detransitioning, and it was a matter of you, I guess, just stopping your drugs, did you talk to any professionals about that, or was it just a personal decision you made on your own, or?
No, I didn't talk to any professionals about it.
Mm-hmm.
I actually did it very irresponsibly. I was very afraid that if I talked to a doctor about it, they would try to talk me out of it, or I would somehow receive, some sort of stigma or backlash for it.
Wait, when you talk
So
to like a medical professional about it, they try to talk you out of it, or?
I've heard. I was afraid that would happen.
Oh, you were afraid that would happen. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, because I'd heard stories like that before, and so I just stopped taking my hormones entirely, and just never returned to my doctor to tell them about it. And it turns out that's actually a pretty common experience for people who end up detransitioning. I think there's a stat that says that only like a quarter of them end up telling their doctors about it, just because they're afraid of what they might respond with.
Were you ever in were you in therapy during all of this?
Not during the process of detransitioning. I was in therapy when I first started transitioning, but um, yeah, not when I was considering detransitioning.
Gotcha. Okay. Did you ever talk to your therapist about, was it like somebody that specialized in trans issues or stuff like that, or was it just like a run of the mill therapist, or?
It was just a normal therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was actually her first trans client, so it was a little bit rocky for both of us, I think.
Gotcha. Interesting. Um, when you, oh yeah, so something that I asked before is it feels like trans people tell me, and it's hard to tell how much of this is placebo versus not. And I think they've even admitted as much in my emails. People say that when they started taking drugs, they like almost like the day of or like the next day, like mentally they felt a lot better. When you stopped taking drugs, did you start to feel worse, or was it just kind of whatever, or?
Points where I felt worse, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, I kind of went on and off for a little while. But part of that is also because I think testosterone does up your energy a lot.
Yeah.
So part of, I think, why I was feeling so bad was just because I was, down a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that I really needed to get used to. But I did eventually, kind of get back to a normal base level mental health.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um. Well, I'm trying to. I don't know if I have any. Are you still on like SSRIs for depression or anything, or?
Yeah, I am.
Uh huh. Gotcha. Um. Well, yeah, I think that's basically all I have. I can't think of anything else. Unless there's anything else you want to bring up or talk about.
No, I think that hit on a lot of stuff.
Oh wait, actually, I do have one more question. You talked about how it seemed like initially a lot of the dysphoria was kind of like it felt a little bit socially reinforced, like women have to be a certain way, and you didn't like that. Do you think that today in your life, do you feel like you embraced like the tomboyish parts of yourself and now you're just comfortable acting that way, or do you feel like you act more feminine because you're okay with acting feminine, or like how do you, like in terms of actions, how do you live now in like that male female like binary, or the masculine feminine binary of behavior?
I think for the most part, it is like kind of embracing that like butch tomboy sort of feeling that I've always had. But in certain ways, I do feel more comfortable now being feminine in some areas. Like, obviously, the way I talk is pretty feminine mannerisms, but
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, I try to like disconnect from too heavily gendering things about myself, just because I think it does contribute to like getting into the thought loops, you know,
Mm-hmm.
about like, am I is this woman presenting? Is this like androgynous? Like, how are people going to see me for this? I try to kind of distance myself from making decisions about my presentation based on, whether they're masculine or feminine. But I do feel like I fall pretty naturally in like a butch tomboy sort of aesthetic.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about or share about your experience or anything, or?
I don't think so. Not that I can think of, I suppose.
Okay, well, hold on, one guy's spamming. My question, please. What? Please, my question. Can you ask if when she first thought of detransitioning, if the idea clicked again like when she originally got the dysphoria diagnosis?
No, it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I had to explore that a lot more because I think it was less about like an internal experience and more about like what actions I wanted to take in my day-to-day life, if that makes sense.
Actually, so I'm going to ask a question about that click.
Okay.
because I'm curious. When you feel like you said that like you had like a click when the trans experience was described to you, do you, and this is a really hard question I understand. Do you feel like you had a click and that like this genuinely explained like, oh my God, I think this is what I'm going through? Or do you think it was more, or do you think there's a chance that it might have just been like, fuck, I have all these problems and this is something that I haven't heard before, so maybe this is it?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard one. I do feel like for some people, transitioning can be a little bit of an escape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so an article that we read,
yourself.
yeah, the big Jesse Signal one, I think, Signal, I don't remember his name. I should know, I'm talking to him tomorrow. But that was kind of expressed as that like, there are problems that teenagers go through that can relate to identity, and that one worry, I guess, not to say that this is a huge thing that happens or that like all trans people are fake or whatever, I'm not trying to say that, but that one worry might be that like if you have problems as a teenager and you're having trouble figuring out your identity, sometimes like being like trans might be like a way where like, oh my God, I think that maybe this is the thing, even if you don't necessarily know yet. So I was kind of curious when you described like that click. Yeah. But
yeah, and now that you mention it, like there definitely was a lot going on in my life, and I guess it's not impossible that it could have been like sort of a form of escape and like building this new persona for myself, but I'm not comfortable saying like 100% one way or another.
Sure.
I think I'd have to talk or think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that's pretty much it. If there's anything else that you feel like, if I have conversations related to this stuff or anything comes up, feel free to shoot me a message or an email. I'm always interested to hear, so yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for talking to me. I know you've been doing a lot of trans discussions lately, so I hope it wasn't too terribly painful.
No, I thought it was interesting. I appreciate the conversation, so.
All right, well, you have a good one, Destiny.
Yep, have a good one.